Hi, friends. My name is Darren Gertis, and I provide these daily news updates on what's going on in Ukraine. Some days, the news just tells a story, and this is not one of those days. This is one of those days where we're just providing critical patches, like think about a computer, critical patches that help you understand the whole picture. We're going to be all over the map today, but it'll help you understand, so stay with me. So first, I want to start yesterday with the Institute for the Study of War. They said Russian force generation efforts combined with Western sanctions are having a financial draining effect on the Russian economy. They're going to be spending 14 to 32 billion dollars more than they otherwise would have been just to pay the conscript soldiers that they're trying to, lure in. Um, The Kremlin's also continuing to rely heavily on financial incentivizing Russians to fight in Ukraine, which is going to strain the economy even more. Add on top of that there are 700,000 or more young military-age men who should be working in the Russian economy that have fled the country, trying to get out so they don't get sent to war. Add to that the 300,000, so you have basically a million men that are no longer doing productive work, and it's going to have as much of a hit on the economy as any sanctions are. The Kremlin is already facing challenges in delivering promised compensation, challenges that are increasing social tensions within Russia. That's really interesting to me too, because the social tensions, it's not something that the Russians are used to, or they're used to. Not They don't pay attention to politics like what we do, and I think that puts Putin in a dangerous place. And I'm not predicting that Putin is going to be ousted or that there'll be a coup or anything like that. But if it happens, if something like that happens, it'll be a very sudden thing that nobody will be able to predict or see coming. It'll just happen. Not predicting it, I'm just saying if it does, that's how it'll go. It won't be a long, protracted thing. Okay, the UK Ministry of Defense. So Russian soldiers serving in Ukraine are increasingly frustrated that they are forced to serve in old infantry combat vehicles, which they describe as aluminum cans. Now, we complain about our stuff as well, but their stuff is a lot more aluminum canny than ours. I mean, their old stuff as opposed to our old stuff. In mid-October, in the face of Ukrainian offensives, Russian armored vehicle losses increased to over 40 a day. Think about this, losing 40 vehicles a day. That's roughly the equivalent of a battalion's worth of equipment. So you can't sustain that for too terribly long, especially when you don't have more coming online. Okay, Russia has likely resorted to acquiring at least 100 additional tanks and infantry fighting vehicles from Belarus. Now that's important because that tells us that they're not actually going to be drawing Belarus into the war, or at least not with armor, and that's how they generally fight. And so this is comforting and it's sad in the same thing. So it's sad that they have to do it, but it's comforting because I can't see that they're going to actually draw Belarus into the war if they're taking their stuff. Armored units and artillery are central to Russians' way of war, and they're now struggling partially due to difficulties in sourcing both artillery, ammunition, and armored vehicles. So that's an interesting perspective. Okay, let's move along. Here, the next article. Russia, this is Radio Free Europe. Russia launches fresh strikes, presses offensive in the east, Ukrainian military says. So the Ukrainian forces are facing Russian attacks in multiple locations. That's all true. They're all getting rebuffed, but they're facing attacks. Then they talked about the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which was damaged. They powered it down, and now Russia is going to be trying to repair it and connect it to the grid, so it's going to be providing power for Russia. I don't know if that's going to happen, but that is a story. That's a legitimate thing going on. Okay, this was great. A joke that went out of control. There was a crowdfunding for weapons in Ukraine. So these these armored vehicles, by Christmas, 50 hardly used FV-103 Spartan armored personnel carriers. It's not a tank. It just carries them into battle fairly safely. Until recently, the property of the British Army was in warehouses, but they're going to be on the front lines. Why? Well, there was a crowdfunding appeal, and the tagline was "Grab them all." It was launched on Wednesday. By Thursday, within 9 hours, half the funds had been raised. By lunchtime on Thursday, they raised all of it. The money was secured, and so like, how are they getting this for this price? Well, they have all these old vehicles that they have replenished with a newer generation of vehicles, so they wanted to get rid of them anyway, and here they are. They're being phased out for newer designs. The 50 on sale are in private hands, and each is said to have fewer than 10,000 miles on the clock. So just like Russia is outsourcing for more vehicles, so are the Ukrainians who are getting more vehicles. Okay, Zelensky, this is talking about if Putin takes part in the G20, Zelensky won't go. I don't blame him. I wouldn't either if I was him. My personal opinion and Ukraine's position was that if the leader of the Russian Federation takes part in the summit, Ukraine will not. And he said that as early as when he was invited by the president of Indonesia many months ago, 5 months ago, something like that. Zelensky, again, I thank the Turkish president Erdogan for his active participation in preserving the grain deal. That's right. Erdogan actually saved this thing and kept it going. Erdogan's the big player in the Black Sea, and that's because the Black Sea is funneled through Turkey. And so their ships outnumber the Russians. They are really the kingmaker there. And because when Russia pulled out, because they couldn't protect the ships, protect them from who? The Russians would be the only ones firing on them, but they couldn't protect the ships. They pulled out, and so Turkey just kept, escorting those ships through. Now, that leaves Putin with an awful choice. Do I fire on Turkish ships and start a war with NATO, or do I back down and realize that I've just pantsed myself before the entire world? And ultimately, he backed down. So Russia is rejoining the grain deal. That's this article. In announcing Russia rejoining the grain deal, President Putin said that Moscow have received assurances that Ukraine would not use the humanitarian corridors to attack Russian forces. Okay, so I don't think they used the humanitarian corridors before. The humanitarian corridors were already part of the deal that they wouldn't use those to attack Russia. So they didn't get anything, but it's a face-saving measure, and it's really smart for Ukraine not to make the point that I just made, that it was already part of the deal. Just let them save face and rejoin the deal. Putin warned Russia reserves the right to withdraw again if Kyiv breaks its word. Okay. Or if they just feel like they're upset about something. Ukraine Foreign Ministry spokesman Nikolenko made it clear that Kyiv had offered nothing new to Russia in return for the deal. She should have just Our state has not undertaken any new commitments that go beyond those already existing in the grain deal, but for the Russian population who Putin is talking to, who he has to be concerned about, he's making it seem like, yeah, I got these deals or concessions. And they're not going to hear anything different unless they have a VPN to actually hear Western news. Ukraine did not plan to use the grain corridor for military purposes. Okay, moving along. Moscow softens nuclear war rhetoric. Russia's economic decline deepens as Putin warns that he could pull out of that grain deal again. So data released on Wednesday by Russia's Ministry of Economic Development showed the country's downturn continued in September. And we already touched on that earlier, but really, it's not just sanctions having effect. You can't just keep sending $1 or $2 million missiles, like 20 of them, 50 of them a day, and then it's not having some kind of impact. You can't just keep sending men into the slaughter. I mean, just sending them into a meat grinder and doing all the things that Russia's doing without it having an effect, let alone sanctions, let alone all the other problems that are caused by mobilization that we already talked about. So they're having some financial problems. President Vladimir Putin said that despite Russia's return to the deal, which had withdrawn from last weekend after an apparent attack by Ukraine on Russia's Black Sea fleet, Moscow reserves the right to withdraw from it again if Ukraine's guarantees are not met. Ha 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 ha. He'll show them, but I'm sure he's getting some great press out of that, and that's fine. Let him withdraw. Let him rejoin the grain deal. Zelensky held a meeting with U.S. Senators Chris Coons and Rob Portman. So what you need to know about this is they're saying we feel real support for Ukraine, both at the party level and the level of American society. Now, Coons is a Democrat. He's from Delaware, and Rob Portman is a Republican from Ohio. So this is always a good sign when you see a Democrat and a Republican showing up together to go onto one of these missions, because it shows much greater support. Now, what's going to happen in a few days, today is the 3rd of November, and what's going to happen is that in just 4 days or so, the vote in the United States is going to be ugly for Democrats. It is. This is 538. This is a somewhat left-leaning, but they try to be accurate polling organization, and their headline is Republicans are just a normal polling error away from a landslide. Okay, so it's going to be a good night for Republicans. This is not to be political, but I'm telling you this to tell you that even in spite of the good night that it's going to be for Republicans, it's probably not going to change anything as far as support for Ukraine goes. And I'm going to be speaking out of school if I go beyond this, so I'm going to shut up and go on to the next article. Okay, Monastirki, we identified those involved in torture of Ukrainians. So the Minister of Internal Affairs in Ukraine said that he's working on large scale to carry out and document crimes, identified those that have been abused in torture facilities. And look at this. Today, the police have more than 25,000 hours of audio conversations between invaders where they talk about their crimes. Like that's crazy. That's significant. Okay, next article here, and this is really interesting to my mind. The court in Sevastopol, and I saw this on Twitter, and then from Twitter I went to go verify. The court in Sevastopol recognized the missing sailors from the cruiser Moscow as dead. Okay, now why is this important? So here in June, Russia refuses to recognize the death of 27 crew members of the sunken cruiser Moskva. Found this on Telegram, where agency news, and I'm not sure about the veracity of agency news, but I try to triangulate. The court in Sevastopol recognizes dead the missing sailors of the crew of Moskva. So when you see a Twitter post, you want to be careful. I don't know what Next to TV is, and you just want to be very, very careful, unless it's coming from the U.S. government, the BBC, the Ministry of Defense of Britain, or something like that. You just want to double check your facts. Okay, so that they finally agreed that these guys are dead. Actually, that recognizes dead 17 people from the military unit, but nonetheless, they're still acknowledging it. Okay, let's look at the ISW today, which was kind of interesting. Russian forces are continuing to withdraw some elements in northwestern Kherson, and now this is looked at: are they withdrawing or is a trap being set? So that's part of it, and then the other part is Russia forces prematurely impaled in insufficient concentration of mobilized personnel in the offensive pushes near Bakhmut. So they're around Bakhmut. They're still trying to take that land, but they just send their raw troops in for slaughter. It's like they don't matter. It's hard for me as an American to wrap my mind around how they could abuse these people so badly or misuse these people so badly by sending them in without the proper training and support and everything else that I would expect. So that's what's going on there. Okay, now with this Kherson report, it reminded me of Denis Davdov. His headline was "Stop! It's a trap." So are they looking like it is? They've withdrawn so that they can lure them in and have pre-coordinated attacks or whatever. We don't know. So they don't have to take the landmass really quickly. So there's no push on their side that they have to run after it, so they can take their time. Okay, now with that though, there was something really interesting in his video. It's about a 30-second long, maybe a minute, that I want to play here that is really interesting. We talked about Ukraine, and when we talk about Ukraine, we're saying stop the Russians so that the Chinese don't get an idea like, hey, let's go take Taiwan. It's worse than that. Like, I'm not one calling for like a World War III is coming, but it could get very bad very quickly. And here's how. For example,
reports that Iran is going to start the war against Saudi Arabia, and Germany calls their citizens to leave Iranian territory as fast as possible using
so the Saudis and the Iranians have always hated each other. They've never really gotten along. But if that kicks off, that could be a whole different problem set. And we have allies on either side of this. And, they say politics make strange bedfellows. So does war. Watch this.
possible transport means. I'm kind of concerned about it, my friends, and Saudi Arabia is the military ally of United States of America,
Mhm.
and I think United States would defend Saudi in that case. It's interesting how everything changes in our global world, and now you may say that Israel is the ally of the Saudi Arabia against the Iran. Obviously, Israel will not defend Saudi Arabia, but they may target some of the targets on Iranian territory. In that way, helping also themselves because they are also the enemy for Iran, but in such a way, Israel may help Saudi Arabia. And still, I would not like to see one more conflict to spark on our planet, my friends. It's better to avoid the war
Yep.
and to replace the Iranian government with all of those protests that are ongoing.
So if you haven't been paying attention to what's going on in Iran, it's very unstable. Not only is it unstable on the ground because of the protests, and I can't get into that right now, but but add to that that Iran is supplying Russia with missiles, not just drones now, but with actual missiles, which is again ticking off the Israelis who are looking at that going, you're violating agreements, and this is their sworn enemy, and wow, it could all get bad. But I want to end with a happy note, and this is the sound of freedom, at least the sound of freedom in Ukraine. This is what HIMARS rockets look like when they go off. Now, we're not going to see an end destination. We are, after all, a family-friendly channel here on YouTube. And so you're not going to see that. But what you know is that these are HIMARS, and they're geolocated and targeted, and these things are going to hit wherever they're going to hit. Okay, thank you for your time. I know that I was all over the map today. I'm sorry for that. There was no clear, like, let's talk about propaganda, or let's talk about the ground war, or let's talk about the political war, or what. We're just all over the map. But these critical patches help you understand what's actually going on in Ukraine. Thank you. If you're still with me and you haven't subscribed, please subscribe, and I'll be back tomorrow. Thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.